Hello everyone, here is a quick video on the unit circle. The unit circle is very important, especially if you have to deal with trig problems. So let's start. I'm not the best drawer, but that's my circle. I'm sticking with it. All right, so with a unit circle, so a whole circle is 360 degrees, well that's 2 pi. If it's a straight line, that is 180 degrees, so that is a pi there. So this is a right angle, that means this point right here, that is pi over 2, or that's a 90 degree, okay? And this is 3 pi over 2, or 270 degrees. So you have 360, you start from here, so that is 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270, and then complete the circle. You go counterclockwise, and that is 360. So this now we'll break it down into 45 degrees. So this one right here would be pi over 4. And each time you add a pi to it as you're breaking. So pi over 4, if you add pi to it, so that would be 2 pi over 4. So that would be right here. So 2 pi over 4 when simplified, that would give you pi over 2. So 2 pi over 4, if we add another pi to it and we break another 45 degrees, that will make it 3 pi over 4. Okay, so add another pi to the 3 pi, that becomes 4 pi. So 4 pi over 4, when you simplify, that is pi. Add another pi to 4 pi over 4, so that will be 5 pi over 4 right here. Okay, so 5 pi over 4, if you add another pi to it, that will be 6 pi over 4, and that simplifies to 3 pi over 2. So 6 pi over 4, add another pi to it. So that will be 6 pi, that will be 7 pi over 4. So 7 pi over 4, if you add another pi to it, that becomes 8 pi over 4. So 8 pi over 4, if you simplify, that is 2 pi. Okay, so this is breaking down into 45 degrees. So now how about if we break it down into 30 degrees. So 30 degree would be right here, which is pi over 6. Remember, pi is 180 degrees, so pi divided by 6, 180 divided by 6, that will be 30 degrees. So pi over 6, if we add that's 30 degrees. So if we add another 30 degree, so that will be 2 pi over 6. So 2 pi over 6, if you simplify, that becomes what? 3 pi. 2 pi over 6 becomes pi over 3. So that's 60 degrees, right? This is 45, 30, 45, 60. So that is 2 pi over 6. So 2 pi over 6, if you add another pi to it, that will be 3 pi over 6. So 3 pi over 6, if you simplify, becomes pi over 2. Okay, so 3 pi over 6, add another pi to it. Okay, so that would be 4 pi over 6. So this would be 4 pi over 6, but we can simplify 4 pi over 6, that becomes what? 2 pi over 3. So this right here would be 2 pi over 3. So that was the 4 pi over 6. Add another pi to it, so that would be 5 pi over 6 right here. This would be 5 pi over 6. If you add another pi to it, that becomes 6 pi over 6. So that simplifies to be just pi. Okay, so 6 pi over 6, so the next one will be 7 pi over 6. Okay. Add another pi to it. So 7 pi over 6, add another pi to it, so that becomes 8 pi over 6. So this point right here would be 8 pi over 6. But you can simplify 8 pi over 6, and that becomes what? 4 pi over 3. So this point right here is 4 pi over 3. So that was the 8 pi over 6. If you add another pi to it, so that becomes 9 pi over 6, which is the 3 pi over 2. Okay, so 9 pi over 6, add another pi to it, that becomes 10 pi over 6. This point right here is the, I'll write it right here. That would be 10 pi over 6, but we can simplify 10 pi over 6, right? Which becomes what? 5 pi over 3. So this becomes 5 pi over 3. So that is 10 pi over 6. Add another pi to it, that